The official cause of death for Marcus Wen is listed as asphyxiation due to equipment failure at a depth of 47 meters. The incident report, filed by Haldane Offshore Services on March 14th, says his helmet seal degraded during a routine hull inspection on the Meridian platform, that his umbilical was recovered intact, that his body was brought topside within 9 minutes, and that resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. I know the report is wrong because I was his dive partner that morning, and his helmet seal did not fail. His helmet was fine, his gas mix was fine, his umbilical was delivering breathing gas without interruption. I watched his camera feed from the dive control shack. I watched him stop moving. I watched him press both hands flat against the hull plate he was supposed to be grinding, and I heard him say very quietly that something underneath the metal was warm. Then his camera went dark. Not static, not a malfunction. The image just smoothly dimmed, like someone turning down a dial, and by the time the tenders pulled him up he was dead, and the recording showed only normal operations with no anomaly of any kind. I have been a commercial saturation diver for 11 years. I have worked the Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea, the coast of Angola, and the Caspian. I am telling this now because 3 days ago I received a new dive medical certificate in the mail, current and valid, from a physician I have never visited, clearing me for saturation work on a platform I cannot find in any active registry. The certificate is stamped, dated, and has my correct diver number. It lists my blood type, my ear equalization history, my last hyperbaric exposure. It is more accurate than any medical form I have ever filled out myself. I need to go back to the Meridian job to explain what I mean. I was working for Haldane Offshore out of their Aberdeen office, which handles most of the North Sea saturation contracts for a handful of mid-tier oil operators. Haldane is not a household name. They are not BP or Subsea 7. They run a small fleet of dive support vessels and win jobs by being cheaper and faster than the majors, which in practice means older chambers, tighter rotation schedules, and supervisors who learned the trade before half the current regulations existed. I had been with them for 2 years. The pay was good. The safety record was acceptable. You learn quickly in saturation diving that acceptable is the best you get. For anyone unfamiliar with the work, saturation diving means living under pressure. When you are working at depths below about 30 meters, the time it takes to decompress back to surface pressure becomes so long that it is more efficient to keep the divers pressurized full time. You live inside a chamber system on the vessel. You eat, sleep, shower, and breathe inside a steel cylinder pressurized to match your working depth. When it is time to work, you transfer through a sealed bell that is lowered to the job site. You exit the bell, do your task on the seabed or on the underwater structure, and return. You might live under pressure for 28 days straight. The only way out is a controlled decompression that takes days. There is no quick exit. If something goes wrong at depth, your choices are to solve it at depth or die at depth. This is the reality of the job, and every diver accepts it. The Meridian platform was an older production installation about 90 nautical miles northeast of Lerwick, in water that runs cold and dark even by North Sea standards. It had been in service since the late 80s and was approaching its decommissioning window, which meant it needed a full subsea structural inspection before the operator could begin planning the removal. That was our job. Haldane had won a 3-week contract to inspect the jacket structure, the risers, the caissons, and portions of the hull below the splash zone. Standard work. You go down. You visually inspect welds and joints for cracking or corrosion. You measure cathodic protection readings. You clean marine growth off critical areas, and you weld repair patches where needed. I had done this kind of job maybe 30 times. The only unusual thing about the Meridian contract was the water depth. Most of the jacket inspection was between 30 and 50 meters, but there were notes in the scope of work about a lower caisson extension that went deeper, down to around 80 meters. The scope said inspection of that section was conditional, pending visibility and schedule. We sailed from Lerwick on the dive support vessel Donan Crest, a converted anchor handler that Haldane had fitted with a 3-man saturation system in the early 2000s. It was not a comfortable ship. The chamber was tight, the plumbing was temperamental, and the gas reclaim system made a grinding noise that never fully stopped. There were 3 divers on this rotation: me, Marcus Wen, and a newer diver named Callum Shea. Marcus and I had worked together before, on a pipeline repair off Teesside the previous autumn. He was experienced, methodical, and very quiet underwater, which is exactly what you want in a partner. Callum was on maybe his 4th or 5th saturation, still learning the rhythms. Our dive supervisor was a man named Grieg Lusk, who ran the control shack and managed our gas, our schedules, our umbilicals, and our communication with the surface. Greg had been supervising for Haldane longer than anyone else on the vessel. We locked into the chamber system on the 2nd day out and began pressurizing to storage depth. By the 3rd day, we were at pressure. The bell checks were done and the first dives started. For the first week, everything was routine. Marcus and I took the deeper jacket inspections, while Callum handled the shallower splash zone work with Marcus or me rotating up to assist. The water was dark at depth, visibility maybe 3 to 4 meters on a good tide, less when the current stirred the silt. The meridian jacket was heavily encrusted with marine growth, anemones, and mussels, and kelp, so thick in places that you had to scrape it back before you could even see the steel underneath. The welds were old but holding. The cathodic anodes were mostly depleted, which was expected for a platform this age. We documented everything, fed measurements back to Greg, and he logged them into the inspection database topside. The first thing that did not fit happened on day 6. I was in the bell with Marcus, waiting to lock out for the 2nd dive of the shift. Greg was running us through the pre-dive checklist over comms. He read out our bell depth, our gas mix, our bottom time allocation, and then he read the grid reference for the work site. The grid reference was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. It was off by 1 digit in the easting, which put our work location about 400 meters north of where we had been diving all week. I told Greg the grid was off. He paused, and I heard paper rustling. Then he came back and said no, the grid was correct. That was what was on the dive plan for that shift. I told him to check again because we had been working the southeast jacket leg all week and the grid he just read would put us on the north face. There was another pause. Then Greg said I was right. He had misread it, and he gave the corrected grid. Standard correction. It happens. People transpose numbers. I did not think about it again until later. That same day, during the dive, Marcus and I were working our way along a horizontal brace about 40 meters down. I was running the CP readings while Marcus was scraping growth off the next section ahead of me. We were maybe 15 meters apart, connected to the bell by our umbilicals, working in the usual silence. I finished a reading and looked up toward Marcus. His helmet light was illuminating the brace in front of him, and beyond the brace, further into the jacket structure, I could see another light. It was faint, a diffuse bluish glow coming from somewhere deeper inside the lattice of crossbeams and vertical members. I called Marcus on the diver-to-diver channel and asked if he could see it. He said yes. I asked Greg if there was another diving operation in the area. Another vessel, an ROV, anything that would explain a light source inside the jacket. Greg checked and said no. We were the only dive operation on the Meridian. There was no ROV in the water. He asked me to describe what I was seeing, and I told him it looked like a work light, maybe a halogen, deep inside the jacket, steady and unmoving. Greg logged it and told us to continue the task. When we were back in the bell and being recovered to the vessel, I asked Greg over comms what he had logged for the light. He said he had noted it as possible bioluminescence or reflected deck lighting penetrating the water column. I told him that was not what it looked like. He said the log entry was made and we would check the next dive. The next dive, the light was gone. We looked. There was nothing. I let it go. On day 8, Callum came back from a shallow dive and mentioned something during our meal in the chamber. He said he had been working near one of the riser clamps at about 20 meters and had noticed tool marks on a section of steel that was not in the inspection scope. Fresh marks. Grinding marks, the kind a diver's pneumatic grinder leaves. He said it looked like someone had recently done weld prep on a plate about 2 meters square, right on the outer hull. He had reported it to Greg, and Greg had told him it was probably residual from a previous maintenance campaign. Callum said that made sense, except that the grinding marks were bright, clean metal with almost no marine growth, which meant they were recent. Weeks old at most, not years. I asked Greg about it during the next comms check, and he said the operator had confirmed that no diving work had been done on the Meridian in the previous 14 months. He said the marks were probably from an ROV intervention that was not flagged in the dive records. I did not push it. In this industry, records are incomplete all the time. ROV jobs are sometimes contracted separately, and the documentation does not always reach the dive crew. But I made a mental note. Day 10 is when things changed. Marcus and I were doing a deeper inspection down near the base of the southeast jacket leg where it meets the mud mat on the seabed. This was around 47 meters. The visibility was poor, maybe 2 meters, and the current was pushing silt around in slow clouds. We were inspecting a series of welded nodes where the jacket braces connect to the main leg. I was working about 10 meters behind Marcus, documenting a section he had already cleaned and measured. His camera feed was running back to the dive shack as usual. I heard Marcus say something on comms. Not to me, not to Greg. He said it softly, almost to himself. He said, "It's warm." I asked him to repeat. He said the steel was warm. I told him that was not unusual near certain riser connections where production fluids run hot inside the pipes. He said he knew that, but he was not near a riser. He was on the jacket leg itself, on an external plate that had no production function. Bare structural steel, 50 meters underwater in the North Sea, should be around 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. He said it felt like touching a radiator. Greg broke in on comms and asked Marcus for his exact position. Marcus read off his depth and approximate location on the structure. Greg told him to move on to the next section. Marcus did not answer immediately. Then he said, "There's something behind this plate." I started moving toward him. His helmet light was visible ahead of me, a white cone in the murk. I could see him pressed close to the jacket leg, one hand on the steel. His camera feed was still running in the dive shack. I know this because Greg later confirmed he was watching it in real time. Then Marcus put both hands flat on the plate. He went very still. I could hear his breathing on the comms, steady and slow, slower than it should have been for a man doing physical work at depth. I called his name. He did not answer. I called again. Nothing. I was closing the distance, maybe 7 meters away now. Greg's voice came over comms, sharp. "Marcus, respond. Give me a status." Silence. I reached Marcus. I put my hand on his shoulder. He did not react. His hands were still pressed flat against the steel plate. I looked at his face through his helmet visor and his eyes were open. He was looking at the plate. Not at me. Not at the water, at the steel, as if he could see through it. Then his camera feed went dark. I know this because Greg immediately started calling for a camera check, asking Marcus to verify his umbilical connections. But I was right there, and I could see his helmet camera. The light was still on. The camera housing was intact, there was no visible damage. The feed just stopped transmitting. At the same time, and I have gone over this in my memory more times than I can count, the water around us changed temperature. Not everywhere. just in the immediate area around the jacket leg where Marcus was standing. It got warm. Not hot. Warm, like stepping into a heated pool. I felt it through my suit, which should not happen. A diver in a hot water suit has heated water circulating through tubes against their skin. You do not feel ambient water temperature changes through the suit under normal conditions, but I felt it. I pulled Marcus away from the plate. He did not resist. He came away easily, like a man half asleep. His hands left the steel, and he drifted slightly in the current. I held on to him and called Greg. I said Marcus was unresponsive and I was bringing him back to the bell. Greg acknowledged and began the emergency recovery protocol. I got Marcus to the bell. It took maybe 4 minutes. He was limp but breathing. His gas supply was normal. His helmet was sealed and functioning. I got him inside the bell, closed the lower hatch, and told Greg we were secure. Greg began recovering the bell to the vessel. Marcus died during the ascent. His breathing slowed and stopped somewhere between 40 meters on the surface. By the time the bell was mated to the chamber, and the tenders opened the inner lock, he had no pulse. They tried to resuscitate him under pressure for over an hour. It did not work. The investigation began immediately. Haldane sent a team from Aberdeen. The health and safety executive sent an inspector. The dive system was locked down, the recordings were pulled, and every piece of equipment Marcus had been using was tagged and bagged. His umbilical was tested. His gas mix was analyzed. His helmet was stripped and examined. His hot water suit was inspected. His harness, his bailout bottle, his tools, his communication rig, everything was checked. Nothing was wrong with any of it. The camera recording from his helmet, which I had watched go dark in real time, played back as a completely normal dive. In the recording, Marcus works his way along the jacket leg, takes readings, scrapes marine growth, and then the recording simply ends at the moment Greg called the emergency. There is no darkness. There is no dimming. The feed does not go black. It just ends, cleanly, as if someone pressed stop. And the timestamp on the end of the recording is 4 minutes before I saw the feed go dark in the water. 4 minutes during which, according to the recording, nothing was being filmed. But I was there. I saw his camera light still on. I saw the feed was running. Those 4 minutes are not on the tape. I told the investigators about the warm steel. I told them about Marcus's words. I told them about the light we had seen days earlier inside the jacket structure. I told them about the fresh grinding marks Callum had found. The warm steel was attributed to a possible localized thermal anomaly from production fluids migrating through microfractures in the jacket grouting. The light was logged as the bioluminescence Greg had already recorded. The grinding marks were ascribed to a prior ROV campaign. Marcus's death was ruled as asphyxiation due to helmet seal degradation, even though the seal was found intact during the equipment inspection. The report noted that microfailures can self-resolve after pressure equalization, making post-incident examination unreliable. I have heard of this phenomenon. It is real. But it did not happen here because the seal did not fail. I was with him. His gas was flowing. He was breathing. The investigation closed in 11 days. Callum and I were decompressed and released from the vessel. The Donan Crest was sent back to dock. The Meridian inspection contract was suspended and, as far as I was told, reassigned to another company. I went home to Inverness. I filed my own report with the HSE, separate from Haldane's. I described everything I had seen and heard. I received an acknowledgement letter and nothing else. For about 3 months, I thought that was the end of it. I took another job, a short saturation on a wind farm installation in the Moray Firth, and tried to put the Meridian behind me. But there were things I could not stop thinking about. The grid reference, the wrong grid reference Greg had read on day 6. I had assumed it was a simple misread, a transposed digit, But after Marcus died, I went back through my personal dive log, where I note grid references and depths for every dive, and I compared the wrong grid that Greg had originally read with the position where Marcus died. They were the same. The wrong grid reference that Greg corrected on day 6 pointed exactly to the location on the jacket leg where Marcus pressed his hands against the plate. At the time Greg read it, we had not yet dived that section. It was not on the schedule for another 4 days. The dive plan should not have contained that grid reference at all on day 6, but it did, and Greg corrected it when I challenged him, as if he realized the number should not have been there yet. I considered calling Greg. I decided instead to request a copy of the dive plan records from Haldane's office. I used a subject access request, citing my right to personal data held by my employer. Haldane sent me a file 3 weeks later. It contained my employment records, my dive logs as entered into their system, and a summary of the Meridian contract. The dive plans were included. I checked day 6. The grid reference on the day 6 dive plan was correct. It showed the southeast jacket leg, the section we had actually been working. The wrong grid, the one Greg had read aloud and then corrected, was not there. It had either been changed after the fact or it had never been recorded the way Greg read it. But I heard him read it. I challenged it in real time. It is on the comms recording. Except when I requested the comms recordings, Haldane told me they had been handed over to the HSE as part of the investigation and were not available for personal data requests. I contacted the HSE. They told me the comms recordings were returned to Haldane after the investigation closed. I contacted Haldane again. They said the recordings were archived and could not be retrieved without a formal legal request. I did not have the money for a lawyer. I let it sit for another month. Then I received an email from a man named Duncan Price. The email came to my personal address, which was unusual because I did not recognize the name and the email domain was a generic offshore consultancy I had never heard of. Price said he was a former Haldane dive supervisor who had worked the Meridian platform in 2019, 4 years before my rotation. He said he had found my HSE report through a contact and wanted to talk. I called him. He lived in Peterhead, on the northeast coast of Scotland. He sounded old, or at least older than his voice suggested he should, tired in a way that goes deeper than sleep. He asked me to describe exactly what had happened with Marcus, and I did. He was quiet for a long time afterward. Then he told me about his rotation. In 2019, Price had supervised a 3-man saturation dive on the Meridian for the same kind of structural inspection. Same scope of work. Same jacket legs, risers, caissons, splash zone. His crew had reported the same light inside the jacket structure, deep in the lattice, steady and bluish. He logged it the same way, as reflected surface light or bioluminescence. His divers had also found the grinding marks. Fresh grinding on structural steel that no one had a work order for. And on day 9 of his rotation, one of his divers, working near the base of the jacket at around 50 meters, had stopped responding on comms. The diver's camera feed went dark. When they recovered him to the bell, he was alive but incoherent. He was decompressed and sent to hospital in Aberdeen. The medical report said he had suffered a hypoxic episode due to a gas mix irregularity. Price said the gas mix was checked and it was correct. He said the diver's umbilical was functioning perfectly. He said the hospital diagnosed hypoxic brain damage, but the diver's blood oxygen levels on arrival were normal. The diver's name was Tomasz Galicki. Price said Tomasz never worked offshore again. He was alive, last Price had heard, living somewhere in Poland, but he did not respond to messages and his family said he did not talk about the work. Price told me something else. He said that before his rotation in 2019, he had reviewed the historical dive records for the Meridian as part of his pre-job preparation. Standard practice for a supervisor. You check what previous inspections found, where the known defects are, what repairs had been done. He said the records went back to the early 1990s, and every inspection cycle, roughly every 4 to 5 years, there was an incident. Not always a death, sometimes an equipment failure, sometimes a medical evacuation, sometimes a diver simply refused to go back in the water and was replaced mid-rotation. But every single inspection cycle had produced an event logged in the lower jacket section, below 40 meters, near the base of the structure. He said he had raised this with Haldane's operations manager before the 2019 job. He was told the pattern was coincidental. Deeper work carries higher risk. Older structures in deeper water produce more anomalies. Statistical clustering, nothing unusual. I asked Price why he was contacting me now, 4 years after his own rotation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I got one too." He meant a dive medical certificate, same as mine. Arrived in the mail unsolicited. Current, valid, stamped, and signed by a physician he had never visited. Clearing him for saturation work. Listing a platform he could not identify. His was dated 2 weeks before mine. I asked him what the platform was called on his certificate. He said it did not use a name. It used a field designation number. He read it to me. I checked mine. It was the same number. I searched every offshore installation registry I had access to. The UK's OPRED database, the North Sea Transition Authority records, the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, the international databases maintained by the offshore industry associations. The field designation number did not appear in any of them. It did not correspond to any active, decommissioned, or planned installation. I ran it through historical databases going back to the 1970s. Nothing. Price suggested we try to find the location using the coordinates, but the medical certificate did not list coordinates. It listed a field designation, a mobilization date, and a vessel name. The vessel was called Bellman's Reach. I searched for it. There is no dive support vessel registered under that name in any maritime database I could access. Lloyd's Register, the Flag State Registries, the IMO Ship Identification Database. It does not exist. I tried a different approach. I contacted 2 former Haldane divers I knew from previous jobs and asked if they had ever heard of Bellman's Reach or the field designation number. Neither had. But one of them, a man named Stuart Cope, who had left the industry in 2021, said something that made me put my coffee down and sit very still. He said he had not heard of Bellman's Reach, but he had received a dive medical certificate in the mail about a month earlier. Same format, same physician he had never met, same clearance for saturation work. He had assumed it was a clerical error and thrown it away. Stewart had never worked the Meridian. He had never worked for Haldane. He had spent his career in the Gulf of Mexico and West Africa. His only connection to any of this was that he and I had once shared a saturation chamber on a job off Nigeria in 2018. He had been my dive partner. That was it. I called Price back and told him. He was not surprised. He said he had been making calls of his own. Of the other 2 divers on his 2019 Meridian crew, one had received the same certificate. The other could not be reached. The one who received it, a man named Alan Buick, had called the physician listed on the form. The physician's office existed. It was a private occupational health clinic in Aberdeen. When Alan called, the receptionist confirmed his appointment. She had his file. She read back his diver number, his medical history, his last chamber exposure date. She asked if he was calling to reschedule. He had never contacted the clinic in his life. Alan went to the clinic. He told Price what happened. The clinic was real. Small, professional, on the 3rd floor of a commercial building near the harbor. The receptionist had his complete diving medical file going back to his first commercial certification. It was accurate. Every detail was correct. She showed him the record of his most recent examination, which had taken place according to the file 6 weeks earlier. The examination notes described his blood pressure, his lung function, his ear equalization response, his vision, his ECG results. Allen told Price the results were plausible. They matched what he would expect from a real exam. But he had not been to Aberdeen in over a year. He had not had a diving medical in 18 months. The physician was listed as Dr. R. Hendry. Allen asked to speak with Dr. Hendry. The receptionist said Dr. Hendry was not available that day. She offered to schedule a follow-up. Allen left. Price gave me the clinic's address. I did not go myself. I was not sure I wanted to be in their system more than I apparently already was. Instead, I searched the General Medical Council register for Dr. R. Hendry in Aberdeen. There was no physician by that name registered with the GMC. There were several Hendrys in Scotland, none with the first initial R practicing occupational health in Aberdeen. The clinic itself had a minimal web presence, a single-page website with a phone number, an address, and a stock photo of a medical office. No staff listed, no reviews. The website domain registration was private. I told Price I thought we should go to the police or the HSE with all of this. Fraudulent medical certificates, a fake physician, a non-existent vessel. He said he had already tried the HSE. He filed a report about the fraudulent certificate. They acknowledged receipt. 2 weeks later, he received a letter saying the matter had been reviewed and no regulatory action was warranted because the certificate, while unsolicited, was issued by a registered clinic and did not constitute a fraudulent document under the relevant regulations. The letter included a reference number. Price checked the reference number against the HSE's online case tracker. The case was listed as closed. The subject line read, "Routine recertification query, no action required." This is the part where I need to be very precise, because what I'm about to describe is the thing I cannot explain, and I have tried. After the call with Price, I went through every document I had from the Meridian job. My personal dive log, my copies of the daily dive plans, my notes, my employment contract with Haldane, my dive medical certificate from before the job, the real one, the one I obtained from my regular physician in Inverness. I spread them all out on my kitchen table and I went through them line by line. My real dive medical certificate, the one I'd obtained before the Meridian rotation, had been valid until the following September. I remembered the appointment clearly. Dr. Anand in Inverness. I remembered the lung function test, the ear examination, the blood draw. I had the certificate in my file in a plastic sleeve and where I kept all my important documents. The certificate in the plastic sleeve was not the one I remembered. It was the new one, the one that had arrived in the mail, the one listing Dr. R. Hendry, the one clearing me for a platform that does not exist on a vessel that does not exist. It was in the sleeve where my real certificate should have been. The original, the one from Dr. Anand, was gone. I searched the entire house, every drawer, every folder, every box. It was not there. I called Dr. Anand's office and asked them to send me a duplicate. They said they had no record of a diving medical examination for me. They had my general medical file, my annual checkups, my prescriptions, but no dive medical. They suggested I might be thinking of a different clinic. I was not thinking of a different clinic. I've been going to Dr. Anand for 7 years. She has done every dive medical I have ever had in the UK. 3 of them. I can describe her office, I can describe the spirometer she uses, an old vitalograph with a cracked plastic mouthpiece she keeps replacing. I can tell you the poster on the wall behind her desk, a faded NHS anti-smoking campaign from the early 2000s. I was there. I remember it, but the record does not exist. I pulled my Haldane employment contract from the file. I had signed it in Aberdeen in the Haldane office on Waterloo Quay before the Meridian job. The contract specified the rotation dates, the vessel name, the day rate, the compensation structure. I had read it carefully and signed both copies, keeping one. The contract on my kitchen table was for a vessel called Bellman's Reach. The rotation dates were in the future. The platform was listed by field designation number only, the same number on the medical certificate. My signature was at the bottom. My real signature, not a photocopy, not a digital reproduction. I know my own handwriting. The ink was blue, the same pen I always use. The signature had the slight wobble on the second letter of my surname that happens when I sign on an uneven surface, which I remember doing in the Haldane office because the desk had a groove in it from a cable channel. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. I called Price and told him. He said the same thing had happened to Alan Buick. Alan's original Haldane contract had been replaced. His original dive medical was gone. In their place were documents for Bellman's Reach, with the future dates, the unregistered field designation, and his own authentic signature. Price's documents had not changed. Not yet, he said. He checked them every day. I asked Callum Shea if he had received a medical certificate. He had not. He said he had not heard from Haldane since the Meridian job and had taken a land-based job in construction. He sounded nervous when I described what was happening and asked me not to call again. I respected that. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to find the Meridian platform's historical dive records independently. Price had described seeing them in Haldane's files before his 2019 rotation, the pattern of incidents every inspection cycle going back to the 1990s. If I could obtain those records, I could establish that the platform had a documented history of unexplained events that Haldane was aware of and failed to disclose to subsequent dive crews. That would be enough to take to a lawyer, maybe even enough for a criminal referral. I filed a Freedom of Information request with the HSE for all diving incident reports associated with the Meridian platform. The response came back in 3 weeks. It listed 2 incidents: Price's 2019 medical evacuation of Tomasz Galicki and Marcus Wen's death on my rotation. 2 incidents in 30 years of diving operations on the platform. But Price had told me he saw the records himself. An incident every 4 to 5 years. That would be 6 or 7 events minimum. I called Price and asked him to check his own records, his pre-job notes, anything he had kept from the 2019 preparation. He said he had his supervisor's planning file at home. He went to look for it. When he called back, his voice was different. The file was there, he said, but the historical dive records section was empty. He remembered printing them. He remembered reading through them, making notes, highlighting the pattern. The file folder was there. The tab was labeled Historical Dive Records Meridian. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 entries. The same 2 entries the HSE had sent me. Tomasz Galicki's evacuation and Marcus Wen's death. Everything else was gone. I asked if he might have moved the pages. He said the folder had not been opened since 2019. There was dust on the tab. The single sheet inside was crisp and clean, as if it had been printed recently and placed inside a folder that had been sitting undisturbed for 4 years. Around this time, I started having trouble with my own dive logs. These are my personal records, handwritten notebooks where I record every dive I have ever done. Depth, time, gas mix, task, notes. I've kept them since my first commercial dive. They are the one thing I trust more than any official record because I write them myself, in real time, on the vessel. I opened the notebook that covered the Meridian rotation. My handwriting was there, the dates were there, the depths and gas mixes were there, but the notes I had written about the light inside the jacket, the warm steel, Marcus's words, the camera going dark, all of my observations about anything unusual were gone. Not erased, not torn out. The pages were intact, the writing was continuous, and it simply did not include any of the things I knew I had written. The entry for the day Marcus died read, Inspection SE jacket leg, 47 meters. Equipment failure MW emergency recovery. Bell secured, end of diving operations. That was all. In my handwriting, in my notebook. In ink that matched the rest of the page. I know what I wrote. I remember the pen stopping as I tried to find the right words for what Marcus had said about the steel being warm. I remember writing it slowly because I wanted to be accurate. The words are not there. Price stopped answering his phone on a Thursday. I called 4 times that day and twice the next morning. On Friday afternoon, his phone number was disconnected. I drove to Peterhead. His house was occupied by a couple who said they had lived there for 3 years. They had never heard of Duncan Price. The house did not look like it had been recently vacated. It looked established, lived in, with family photographs on the walls and a garden that had been maintained across seasons. I went to the Peterhead Harbor Master's office because Price had told me he sometimes did casual work on fishing vessels to stay busy. The Harbor Master had no record of a Duncan Price. I checked the electoral roll. No Duncan Price in Peterhead. I checked the IMCA database for his dive supervisor credentials. No record. I sat in my car in the harbor car park and tried to think clearly. Either Duncan Price was real and every trace of him had been removed, or Duncan Price was not real, and I had spent weeks having detailed, coherent, verifiable conversations with a man who did not exist. The conversations felt real. I could remember his voice, the way he paused before important details, the sound of his dog barking in the background during one call. But I had no recordings, no emails because his email account was now inactive. No letters, no photographs, nothing. I drove home. I went directly to my kitchen table. The documents were still there. The contract for Bellman's Reach, the medical certificate from Dr. R. Hendry, my dive notebook with its sanitized entries. I picked up the contract and looked at the mobilization date. It was 10 days away. I called Stuart Cope, the diver in the Gulf who had received a certificate and thrown it away. His number rang through to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me back urgently. He has not returned the call. His social media profiles, which I had checked recently when we first spoke, are gone. His LinkedIn, which listed his diving career in detail, now shows a Stuart Cope who works in logistics in Manchester and has no connection to the offshore industry. I called Callum Shea. His number was still active. He answered. I asked if anything strange had happened since we last spoke. He said no, and he sounded normal, and he asked me if I was all right. I told him about the documents, about Price, about Stuart Cope. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I don't remember a Duncan Price on the Meridian job. I said Price was not on our rotation. Price was on the 2019 rotation. Callum said, No, I looked at my records after you called last time. My contract says the 2019 inspection was done by our crew. You, me, and Marcus. Supervised by Greg. Same crew, same vessel. It says we did the Meridian in both 2019 and 2023. I told him that was impossible. I'd never been to the Meridian before 2023. My first contract with Haldane was signed in 2021. I was working in West Africa in 2019. I have passport stamps, flight records, pay stubs from a completely different company. Callum sent me a photograph of his contract. It listed 2 Meridian rotations, 2019 and 2023. Same crew both times. Both signed by Greg Lusk. Both under Haldane Offshore Services. Both on the Donan Crest. I went to my own files. My Haldane contract, the one that had already changed once, now showed the same thing. 2 rotations, 2019 and 2023. I looked at my passport. I looked at my 2019 pay stubs from the West African job. They were there. They were real. The West African job happened. But the Haldane contract said I was on the Meridian in 2019. Both things could not be true, and I was holding evidence for both. I have not worked since. The mobilization date on the Bellman's Reach contract has passed. Nothing happened on that date that I am aware of. No one contacted me. No vessel arrived. No taxi came to take me to the heliport. The date came and went like any other day, but the contract is still on my table, and the date on it has changed. It now shows a new date. 3 weeks from now. I have been to 2 doctors, my GP in Inverness and a psychiatrist she referred me to. I have been evaluated for delusional disorder, for confabulation, for psychotic symptoms. My cognition is intact. My memory for everything outside of these events is normal. The psychiatrist said I showed no signs of psychosis. She said the documents I brought were real physical objects. She held the contract. She read the medical certificate. She noted that the physician listed on the certificate did not appear in the GMC register. She wrote in her report that my account was internally consistent and that I did not display thought disorder. She also wrote that the events I described were not possible. I asked her how to reconcile those 2 assessments. She did not have an answer. I check the contract every morning. The mobilization date continues to update. It is always approximately 3 weeks in the future. The field designation number does not change. The vessel name does not change. My signature does not change. Only the date moves, as if the departure is not a fixed event, but a window that follows me forward through time, staying just close enough to see. I went back to the Haldane office in Aberdeen last month. The building on Waterloo Quay still exists. The ground floor office where I signed my original contract is now occupied by a marine insurance broker. They have been there for 18 months. They have no knowledge of Haldane Offshore Services. I checked company's house. Haldane Offshore Services Limited was dissolved 7 months ago. The dissolution filing lists no outstanding contracts, no active employees, and no dive operations in progress. But the medical certificate clearing me for work has a Haldane reference number. The contract has a Haldane header. The dive plans, the ones I received through my subject access request, have Haldane document control stamps. These are documents from a company that no longer exists, describing an operation that cannot be verified, on a vessel that has never been registered, supervised by men whose records are vanishing, clearing me for work at a location that appears in no database on Earth. I do one thing now that I did not do before. Every morning, when I check the contract, I also check the crew list. For months, it said 3 names. Mine, Alan Buick's, and a third I did not recognize, a man named J. Olafson. Last week, Alan Buick's name was gone. In its place was Callum Shea. I called Callum. He was fine. He said he had not received any documents. He said he was still working in construction. He said he had not thought about the Meridian in weeks. He asked me again if I was all right. I told him yes. I did not tell him about the crew list. I am not sure what telling him would change. The documents do not seem to require anyone's knowledge or consent. They are simply correct, or they become correct, and the question of whether you agreed to be on them does not appear to be a factor the system considers. The last thing I want to say is about Marcus. I have looked at the incident report many times. I have read the conclusion, the asphyxiation finding, the equipment failure that did not happen. But there is one detail in the report that I did not notice until recently, because it is in the appendix, in a technical annex about the post-incident inspection of the jacket structure. After Marcus died, the operator sent an ROV to inspect the area where he had been working. The ROV survey found everything in order. Standard marine growth, standard corrosion, standard anode depletion. But one frame of the ROV video, buried in the technical annex as a still image, shows the plate Marcus had his hands on. The plate where he said the steel was warm. In the image, the plate is clean. No marine growth, no corrosion. Bare, bright steel, as if it had been recently ground and prepared for welding. And in the center of the plate, barely visible in the ROV's lighting, there is what appears to be a weld bead. A single straight line of fresh weld, clean and even, laid down by a human hand with a stinger electrode, the kind of weld I have done 10,000 times. The ROV survey was conducted 9 hours after Marcus was declared dead. No diver entered the water between his death and the ROV deployment. No welding equipment was deployed. The weld on that plate was made by someone at 47 meters in the dark, in the cold. In the 9 hours between Marcus's last breath and the moment the ROV camera passed over that steel. The incident report does not mention the weld. The still image is in the annex, but it is not referenced in the text. No one has ever asked about it, and the investigation is closed. I look at the contract every morning. The date moves forward. The crew list updates. My name remains. The mobilization date is always 3 weeks away, which means it will never arrive, and it will never stop arriving. I do not know what happens if I stop checking. I do not know if that is what happened to Price. The water was warm. That is the part I keep coming back to. Not the documents, not the missing records, not the company that dissolved, not the physician who does not exist. The water was warm, and it should not have been. And Marcus felt it before I did. And whatever is behind that plate is still there, 50 meters down, in the dark, and it is ready for someone to finish the weld.